I'm Sarah Privado, and I will be your host for today. And for those of you who may be just joining us for the first time, Exploring by the Sea of Plants is about bringing science, adventure, and conservation. Sorry about that. Science, adventure, and conservation to classrooms across North America and beyond. And so today we have about 180 students joining us from across Canada and the United States. And before I introduce our guest today, Zach, let's say hello to our classroom. So coming up, we have Miss Carton's classrooms, a group of grade thirds from grade threes from Anchorage.
I say hi.
All right, and then we have Miss Capella's classroom. They're a group of grade. Hi guys, I'll mute your mic. Group of grade fours from Ontario. Thanks for joining us today. And then we have Miss Hallmark's classroom. They are joining us from Texas. They're a group of grade threes as well. How are you guys doing today? Hello. And then last but not least, we have Miss Fuller's classroom. They have got a group of grade 5 and 6s coming from Kitchener, Ontario. Awesome. And so looks like we have a good crowd today. And so how the hangout is going to go is I'll introduce Zach, and then I'll let him take over and talk to you guys. And then we'll go around each classroom for questions. And for those of you who may be joining us on YouTube Live, I'll be keeping an eye out on the question bar on the YouTube channel for any questions that you guys may have there. All right, so joining us today is Zack Rago, and Zach is the Youth Outreach Manager for Exposure Lab's Chasing Corals Impact campaign. And he's thrilled to engage youth around the globe through science, art, and passion. Zach is a passionate science communicator and interested in developing the next generation of stewards, you guys, for the natural world. He has been working in the ocean space for most of his career, and he was working with the nonprofit Teams for Oceans, an underwater camera company, View Into the Blue, where he became involved with the production of Chasing Coral. He also has experience working in the aquarium world, where he followed his love for corals and holds a bachelor in Evolutionary Biology and Ecology from the University of Colorado. So thanks for joining us today, Zach. I'll let you take over for today.
Thank you guys, and I hope everybody's doing well today. I've done these in the past, and what I used to do was show like some slides, and it was mostly just me talking at you. So today I'm going to keep it very open-ended, and we're just going to have a discussion about how cool the coral reef is, or any other questions you guys have about the ocean or scuba diving, or corals in particular. So at that, I'll just give like a little bit more of an introduction to myself. And I do have one question just so that I can have it in my head. Is any of you in any of the classrooms seen my movie Chasing Coral? So I see one of the classrooms for sure. Okay, so very cool. So that'll put me into my intro. And my name's Zach. I absolutely adore coral reefs. I think they're the coolest thing in the world. Corals are some of the most unique organisms on the planet. And, they've been through kind of a hard time over the past 5 years. And my job is to document and basically show the world what's happening to corals, which is kind of cool. So in doing so, I've spent nearly 10 days of my life underwater. I've been to many, many different countries all over the world, in some of the most remote places in the world, diving. And I've been able to see coral reefs thrive and suffer in multiple places around the world. So does anybody have any questions to start, or should we talk about maybe, what is a coral, for instance? Because that's a pretty tough question for a lot of people, because it's not a super straightforward answer. So should we talk about that, or does anybody have any burning questions to start us off?
I see some hands.
I see some hands.
Okay, let's head over to Miss Capella's classroom.
Number 1.
We have been learning about coral and the causes of bleaching and death.
Have we?
We are going to start our public service announcement to get the word out about the issues regarding coral and coral bleaching. What is the number one thing we should be talking about in terms of solutions? What can we do to help?
So those are great questions, and it makes me super happy to hear that you guys are doing a public service announcement and taking this issue under your wings. That's exactly what we need to do, right? When it comes to what those actions actually look like, I think that it's kind of a complicated answer, but I think it's also very easy for you guys to have a really big impact. What a lot of people don't realize is that youth, like you guys, actually have way more power than we give you credit for. Your voices are really important. So the number one thing to do is to simply talk about it, right? Whether that's within your school, like you're saying, as a public service announcement, and getting other people engaged with what you guys care about, if that's coral bleaching. But it's also talking about it with your family and your friends, and trying to get people involved to know, hey, corals are not doing too well right now, and we can do something about it. And it sounds like that's what you guys are going to do. So that could be anything from using your water bottles less to lessen the amount of plastic in our oceans, because plastics are bad for everything in our oceans, including corals, right? Birds don't like plastic, sea turtles don't like plastic. Well, corals don't like plastic either. We actually know that corals can eat the plastic, and that makes them kind of sick, just like us. But there's lots of cool things you can do.
Okay, so it looks like Miss, we got one hand coming here.
Did you want to ask your question? I guess some of us we don't know as much about coral.
Cool.
So maybe if there's just like a couple of key things that could just because we study global citizenship, but we don't know really much of the link between being a global citizen or what's happening in the world's oceans and coral, and why coral is such a big deal.
Totally. So even for me, I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, which is like about as far away from the ocean and coral reefs as you can get. So it's not super surprising that most people don't know anything about coral. I was one of those people not too long ago. But corals are really, really, really cool animals. So they are an animal, but they're stationary. So they sit on the bottom of the ocean floor, and they don't move. They can't swim away. They're actually an animal that builds a rock. So corals can actually build a skeleton underneath their tissue, and they create these huge structures that you can even see from space. So if you're like on Google Earth, for instance, you can actually see the Great Barrier Reef all the way from like the International Space Station, way up where the astronauts are living. So they're very, very good at building themselves. But they have a catch. Not only are they animals, but they're also plants. So corals are really unique because they have plants in their skin. So if we were a coral, for instance, you could imagine we would be green. We'd have algae inside of our skin. And instead of having your lunch break in your cafeteria, we would all go outside and sunbathe for a few hours. And that algae would actually produce our food for us. So we would never eat again, and we would actually just go sit outside on the grass and sunbathe in order to get our meals. And that's how corals work. It's kind of cool. But now, just to give an explanation about how bleaching works, is these algae that are producing the food for the coral, right? Like if we had algae in our skin again, if it got too hot outside, that algae gets kind of mad. And instead of producing food, it produces really nasty stuff that's harmful to the coral. It would be similar to us getting sick. You know, if you get the flu and you might throw up, that's because you're trying to get rid of something that's not good for you. Corals do the same thing with their algae. Once it gets too hot, these corals spit out their algae and they become jet white. There's no more color with the coral. And that means that they no longer can feed anymore. They can't go outside and sunbathe because they don't have their little plants to provide their energy. And that can kill a coral long term. And that's happening really frequently right now. And a lot of corals have died because of this kind of phenomenon of bleaching. So that's kind of the baseline of what coral is and why they're in a little bit of trouble right now. It's mostly because their water's too warm, and their friends, the algae that lives in their skin, kind of freaks out a little bit, and then they get sick, so to speak.
All right, do we have any more questions Just a show of hands after that little introduction. Okay, we got Miss Capella's class again. If you guys want to ask another one.
How do we get our public service announcement, but where it will have the greatest impact?
Yeah, so I think you've got a couple different options. I'd say first, just within your school, right? You guys could try and set something up at your own school to identify where you can be more sustainable and better for things like coral reefs, right? So one of those could be recycling, for instance. Some schools have recycling and some schools don't. So if you're not very good at recycling, you could kind of create a PSA to your school to say, you know what, we're going to be better with plastics at our school. Another one could be like having like a, like a don't drive to school day, or trying to get like a reusable water fountain, for instance. There are a lot of little small things that you guys can come up with to do. And then the other thing you could do would be to like host an event at your school. One of the things that I do with my work is I allow people, especially students, to host like movie nights with my film at your school. And then you can actually show the coral bleaching and the story of coral to everybody in your local community. And you can start a discussion and then use that as a platform for your PSA. And you can try and engage the community or your parents and other people within your local town to get involved with what you want to do with your PSA, which I think could be really cool.
There we go.
That answers your question.
Yeah, so I think you basically just touched on trying to have more reusable plastics, or just reduce the amount of waste that everyone makes.
Totally. I think that's the big number one, because our warming oceans have more to do with like what we emit, and by using a bunch of plastics we emit more, as well as the plastics being pretty nasty to life on Earth. So anything that you can do to just make yourself more sustainable is a really awesome thing.
Absolutely. And one thing is, like, sometimes you don't always have to create a huge public service announcement, is you can make little changes in your own life. So I'm sure you guys all bring lunches to school. Maybe just having a lunchbox instead of a brown bag when you go to school, or instead of having a juice box, you try to create little reusable containers where you refill your things. And just making less waste at your school will make the smallest difference, but the largest impact. Okay, looks like we have one more question coming in from Ms. Carton's classroom.
How does coral form?
Yeah, so corals are pretty interesting. So they start out as basically like a little larva. You can think of it, they kind of almost look like little worms, kind of, when they're babies. And they're kind of funny. They do like a little shimmy. So they literally kind of like wiggle their little butts onto the ground when they're a larva. So they wiggle on down, set their butt onto a rock, and then they actually start building a skeleton. And they grow into a fully fledged coral, and eventually they become a big coral reef like the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. But they start as basically these little worm-looking things that wiggle their little butts onto a rock and start a new coral reef. It's an awesome question. It's kind of cool. And when I say they wiggle their butts, I totally mean that. They literally do a little like shimmy shake.
Okay, and we got another question from that classroom.
How does plastic affect the coral?
Yeah, so plastics affect coral in a couple different ways. A lot of other organisms in the ocean are probably worse impacted by plastics. So things like sea turtles. Sea turtles eat jellyfish. And when you have a plastic bag in the ocean, they actually look very similar to a jellyfish. And so a lot of organisms actually can get hurt by eating plastic bags and things like that. And they get stuck in their insides, and it can be pretty gross and really harmful for the organisms. But for corals, the big worry is small plastics. So when you have plastics in the ocean, they're getting beat up by waves and floating around, and they're getting kind of broken down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. And the corals can actually eat those little pieces too. And those plastics can have some nasty chemicals in them that really hurt the coral. So we've seen that corals can actually eat plastic, which is not good for them. And the other thing that can happen is, going back to like plastic bags, is things like that can actually get caught in coral. Coral are, built out of these really elaborate skeletons that can be quite pointy and jagged, and things can get caught up in those corals very easily. And if a plastic bag gets caught up in the corals, then what that can do is actually block out the sunlight. So we talked about how corals eat like they're sunbathing, right? Well, if we put a plastic bag over the top of us when we're sunbathing, then we're not getting enough light and we can't produce our food anymore. So if a coral gets plastic covered all over it, then it can die too because it lost its food source. It can kind of starve to death.
Very good question coming from that classroom. So we haven't had a chance to talk to Ms. Hallmark's classroom. If you guys want to ask a question, you guys can do so.
Yes, we have a question. Go ahead, Buddy. How do coral reefs form?
Was it why do coral reefs form?
How do coral reefs form?
So corals have been on the planet for a really, really long time, which is pretty cool. In fact, corals have been on Earth longer than plants have been on land. So they've been around for hundreds of millions of years, and they've changed a lot over that time frame. But the way that they form now is kind of what we talked about before with the little larva wiggling its little butt. Now, that happens to individual corals, but on a special night in Australia where I work, this happens in November. And on the full moon, every single coral in Australia spawns. Basically what that means is they're reproducing and they throw their babies into the water. Thousands and millions of these babies all at once. And now those little babies can float all over the world through our ocean currents, and they can land just about anywhere in the world. And so that's how we get new corals throughout the globe, is because they have a really cool reproductive strategy. So they literally send their babies globally. And those new babies that are floating around in the water currents can now land anywhere. And you get new coral reefs and areas where corals can kind of come about like that. So it's kind of cool. Not a whole lot of things do that. You can think of it similar to like, it's springtime now. So there's like a lot of pollen in the air, right? And pollen makes new trees eventually. So corals are very similar. They're just doing it through water instead of wind.
I think that classroom had another question. I had lost it on my end, but it was, what are the number one things that are hurting corals right now?
Yeah, so corals are under a lot of different pressures. The number one thing that is hurting corals is going to be temperature. So our oceans are getting warmer and warmer every year. And corals live in a very fragile ecosystem. They're very sensitive. And big changes in their temperature and their surroundings has a really big impact on them. So we kind of explained how warm waters bleach corals, make them lose their algae. But there's also lots of other things that are hurting them. Plastics is one of those. And then we also have things like nutrient runoff. So in a lot of places, like countries that might not have the same type of privilege as Canada or the US, they have less infrastructure. So things like sewage or fertilizers get put into rivers, and then those end up in the ocean, and those can cause a lot of harm to corals as well. And the last big one is going to be overfishing. So everything's a big balanced ecosystem in the ocean. Everybody kind of has a role, and everybody has to be balanced in order to keep an ecosystem healthy. So with overfishing, if you take away the sharks or the big fish, that impacts the whole food chain. And that means that other organisms are either going to not have their food supply, or they're going to overgrow, and then the ecosystem gets imbalanced, and then everything kind of starts to fall apart a little bit. So overfishing is a really big one too that we have to worry about. But bleaching and the warming of our oceans is the number one thing that corals are challenged by right now. It's a really good question.
Absolutely. So we haven't had a chance to hear from Miss Fuller's classroom. So why don't we head to them and see if they have any questions? So we got a couple hands up.
When you've been scuba diving, what's the most dangerous case you've got in?
The most dangerous place I've gone?
Yeah.
So most scuba diving isn't necessarily dangerous. Everything has its risk. Scuba diving definitely have its risks, but we're really, really prepared and careful as to not put ourselves in a dangerous situation, right? But I've been in some situations that are definitely a little scary. So I had a good friend and a colleague in Australia get stung by an irukandji jellyfish, which is a very, very scary thing. So it's a very small little jellyfish about the size of your pinky nail. They're super little, you can't see them, and when you get stung by one, it's really, really painful and not very fun. So that's probably the most dangerous thing that I've ever seen happen. But I've been on some scary dives. When it's really murky and you can't see much, that can kind of be scary. I've been in some water that's like swimming in pea soup, where you can't even see your hand in front of your face.
I saw another hand up there, so why don't we head back to that classroom for another question?
How many coral reefs have you seen?
Have people seen or have I seen?
Have you seen?
So I've done a lot of work throughout the Caribbean. So I used to work in places like Bermuda, the Bahamas, Belize, Panama, Bonaire. Those are a lot of the places that I work in the Caribbean, but I also do a lot of work in Hawaii, and I do a bunch of work in Australia. So the Great Barrier Reef is really where I like to go and do my work. But the Great Barrier Reef is really, really cool because not only is it one huge reef, in fact, it's about the same size as the east coast of the United States, which is pretty big. It's also made up of individual reefs. So it's not just one big reef, it's like 4,000 reefs all making up one big Great Barrier Reef. So I've been to a bunch of those in Australia.
Do you have any? Okay, we got one more hand going up.
So what's your most proud of or favorite photography you've done in the water in specific places in the world?
Yeah, so I actually have a pretty good answer for this. I was very lucky. I work with a guy named Charlie Veron, and if you watch the movie Chasing Coral, you'll get to meet him. But he's kind of the godfather of coral science, and I totally idolized him when I was younger, and now I've been lucky enough to work with him. But I went on an expedition with him up in the far north Great Barrier Reef, basically in an area called the Torres Strait, which is the chunk of water that splits Australia from Papua New Guinea. And what we got to do was go look at coral reefs after a bleaching event, but we found a place that's absolutely incredible and beautiful. And we actually discovered the first new species of coral in over 30 years. And I was the first person to ever take a photo of it. So that is definitely my coolest photography moment because only one picture has been taken of this coral and I got to take it.
It's not a bad moment. We'll head back to Miss Carton's classroom. We got a question there.
Okay, we have two. Go ahead and go with our first one. About getting rid of.
How do we get rid of the plastic in the ocean?
Like the plastic that's already there doing the damage.
Yeah, that's a huge, huge question. So I think it's twofold. So we definitely have to work pretty hard to get what we can out of the ocean, right? There's a lot of plastic, and there are some really cool ideas about how we can get plastic out of the ocean. One of which is there's some projects where they put these big things, they kind of look like a big V in the ocean, and these machines kind of swim around and suck plastic into them and take them out of the ocean to kind of clean. One of my favorite organizations is a thing called 4Ocean. They make these bracelets, this guy right here with the blue. And what they do is they sell these very simple bracelets for like $20. But when you buy one, you take 5 pounds of plastic out of the ocean for every bracelet that you buy. And that's kind of how they model it. You spend this money to buy a bracelet, and they go out and they help clean the ocean. Now, we definitely have to clean. There's no question about that. But it's kind of like a boat that has a hole in it, and you're taking buckets of water out to try and save yourself. You can't just keep taking buckets of water out. You have to plug the hole eventually, right? So with plastics, it's kind of the same thing. We have to clean up some of what we've done, but we also have to get really creative about how do we just stop using as much anyways. And that's really important. How can we limit the amount that we're actually utilizing today? And I think that's where it gets really challenging. So we've already seen a lot of states and cities kind of begin banning these bad plastics like plastic bags or styrofoam. And it's going to take more of that. I like to use an analogy, especially with younger people like you guys. It's kind of like the world has thrown a big party. Let's say it's a big birthday party. For the last 100 years, we've thrown this big party and you guys weren't invited. But now we're inviting you to help clean up the party. You didn't get to have any of the fun. You didn't get any birthday cake, but you got invited over to clean up the mess. That doesn't seem very fair, right? So while I think we do need to clean up a little bit, my challenge to you guys as you grow up is not to clean up the party, but to throw a better party. Throw a better party that doesn't need to be cleaned up, because that's the mentality that we have to have, is instead of fixing all of the problems, we have to actually begin finding new solutions to get rid of them in the first place, if that makes sense. That's an awesome question, though.
Okay, we'll head to Ms. Capella's classroom again. I see some hands.
How did you get interested in coral and diving?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, I grew up in Colorado. So I'm very, very far away from the ocean. I live in the Rocky Mountains. And diving isn't necessarily something I just get to go do in my backyard. But I was very lucky growing up. Both of my parents are educators. They teach at a high school and an elementary school. But my dad actually runs a program where he takes 40 kids out to Hawaii every year for marine biology credit. So they go for school and they live in dorms and they learn about both Hawaiian culture and the marine biology of the Hawaiian Islands. And so when I was your guys' age, I got to go to Hawaii and kind of shadow high school kids doing science. And I just absolutely fell in love with the ocean and kind of the mystery and vastness of this ecosystem. And from there, I kind of never turned back. I just continued to want to work with the ocean and with corals. And I got a job when I was in high school growing corals commercially. So I grew them for people that have aquariums. And then I got involved with the making of this movie that was about coral reefs and bleaching. So I think it was mostly just persistence, finding something that I really love and not taking no for an answer and just continuing to find a way to build a career about what I was passionate about. But a lot of it was being in the right place at the right time. But I had a very unique skill set in being able to dive really young and having a lot of experience working with corals. And I was given an opportunity to put those skills to use, and I just tried to make the most out of it, I guess.
It's a great story, Zach. And it seems like having exposure to the ocean when you were younger has impacted your career as you've grown. How would you recommend for students who maybe are interested in the ocean or maybe getting more into scuba diving? How would you recommend they would start if they are someplace in like Colorado or anything like that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think we live in a really cool time. Like, it's pretty cool that I get to sit here in like my kitchen basically and talk to people all over the world about corals. And we live in a really exciting time where there are a lot of opportunities for kids like you guys to get involved with these different projects. despite whatever ecosystem it is. Some of you might be really into the ocean, and there will be opportunities for you to engage with that. And some of you might be into other things. So I think it's about sticking true to whatever you're interested in, and then looking for opportunities that that can allow you to participate in those. But when it comes to diving, no matter where you are, even if you don't have an ocean, you can still go dive and get certified. Like in Colorado, we've got a handful of places that we can go dive, given it's very, very cold. But you can still definitely go get dive certified and get yourself prepared to work on that type of stuff, which is really cool. And for younger folks, there's a lot of opportunities that people are like willing to help with. So I used to run a nonprofit that would take kids like you out into the field and work with cool technology in the ocean. So there's a lot of awesome stuff going on.
Awesome. Okay, so why don't we head to this Miss Carton's classroom one more time, and then we'll get a chance to go to the classroom again.
Okay, so these will be our last two because we have to disconnect right afterwards.
Sure.
And so go ahead and ask yours.
Are
Coral and
are
family.
corals
Like what?
like relationship from each state?
Like are they related to anything else or to each other? Do they have like families and things?
Yeah, so corals are part of a class of organisms called cnidarians. So corals are very similar to jellyfish, as well as anemones. So like in Finding Nemo, the anemone that they live in, they're kind of like a coral as well. So you've got like 3 different stages, and I'll use my hands because I think that it makes a little bit of sense. But you have jellyfish, which are like this. They kind of upside down and go like that. And they're called a medusa. And then you have anemones, which are like the opposite. They sit on the floor and they open facewards up. And then you have corals, which are also like anemones, but they have a skeleton. So they live inside of like a little cup that they built themselves. And all of them are very similar. They have stinging cells. That's why like you hear people like fire coral, oh, give me a rash. They have little cells that's how they eat things out of the water, whether it's fish or a human touching it and stinging you. But they also have no brain, which is pretty cool. They don't have a neurological system. They just kind of have like a neural mesh. It's like a bunch of nerves, but no actual brain, which is pretty cool, right?
No brain. And then go ahead.
What inspired you to study coral reefs?
We talked about one.
Yeah, I mean, I really, really love corals. I think that they're almost alien in nature, and I've always been infatuated with them, even when I was your guys' age. And then I think when I was in college and began to learn about the troubles that corals were facing, and particularly coral bleaching, I jumped on an opportunity to be able to share that story because the ocean is really hard to get to. Not a lot of people have opportunities to spend time underwater. And so when there's something bad happening or something good happening in the ocean, it can kind of be out of sight and out of mind to most people. It's different than like a wildfire in your backyard where it's very present and worrying because it's right there next to you. The ocean's a little bit harder because people don't spend time there every day. So I took an opportunity to try and show the world this place that I care about a lot.
Everybody say thank you.
Thanks for joining us today, guys. Okay, so now we only have 2 classrooms left, so we have a bit more time for questions. So why don't we head to Miss Hallmark's classroom? Looks like we have some eager hands up, and we'll get them a chance.
Cool.
Hey, Zach, how deep does coral grow in water?
Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you guys, I think, on this class.
How deep does coral grow under the ocean?
Was the question, how does the coral grow under the ocean?
Yes, how deep?
Oh, how deep? So it's a little bit of a complicated answer. because there's a lot of different types of coral. But coral reefs, as probably we think about them, like the Great Barrier Reef, for instance, they grow very, very shallow, but they can also grow, as deep as like 300 feet. And that's like the true coral reefs. They get pretty deep. We call that the twilight zone. That's where the sun stops kind of shining through, and they can get really, really deep. I've been as deep as 150 feet, and there are definitely corals down there. Then you get into some of the weird corals, and some of the weird corals can grow as deep as thousands of feet. So they have things called black corals, and they grow like in the deep, deep areas where there's no more sunlight. There's, a very different ecosystem than up in the shallows. And those corals are also some of the oldest things on the planet. We've found some black corals that are like 4,000 years old.
How do you tell how old those corals are?
So corals are very cool. They actually grow in a similar way that trees do. So they build their skeletons in seasonal layers, just like trees. So if you guys know that you can like cut down a tree and you can count its rings to figure out how old that tree is. Well, corals actually have very similar rings that you can count and figure out how old they are. So that's how we do it. We kind of call it coring corals. And those rings have a big story to tell us. And one of those stories is how old it is.
Very cool. So they're kind of like the trees of the ocean, would you say? Awesome. So let's head back to Miss Hallmark's class. I see another hand there.
What is another way you can help coral reefs?
Did you get that, Zach?
No, say it again. Sorry.
What is another way you can help corals? What's another way you can help coral reefs?
So I think the biggest way that we can help coral reefs is to go diving. One of the things that always is fascinating to me, so I grew up idolizing Jane Goodall. So what Jane Goodall did was she lived in Gombe National Park in Africa with gorillas and chimpanzees. But she did it for 50 years, spending all of her time learning as much as she can about these organisms. In my case, I joke that we can't Jane Goodall the oceans. I only get 2 hours at a time underwater because I have to have a tank of air. It's pretty complicated. I've got all kinds of crazy equipment on me. It's not as easy as maybe some other ecosystems to work in. Now, that means that citizen science is unbelievably important for corals, and that's kind of where you guys come in. We need as many people in the water as we can, and if you can share back data or photographs or just your observations of the corals, that actually helps the science world a lot. And so I think we need more and more people to get out there and get in the water and actively help. And I think the last one, which we kind of already touched on, is there is no silver bullet to these issues that our ocean and our world are facing. There's not one straight answer that's going to solve all of our problems. But if we're all collectively doing our best and taking actions to make us more sustainable, then that act collectively comes together and is actually quite meaningful. So, if all the classrooms that we talked to today go out and start talking about coral and making a decision to do better in their schools, that's actually a really big deal. And I think that's the best way to move forward. But if you have an opportunity to go experience the coral reef, I think that's the most important because you're guaranteed to fall in love with it.
Very good. So we'll head to Miss Capella's classroom and then we'll head back to Miss Hallmark's classroom to wrap it up.
Can you explain about when the coral was illuminated purple in the movie?
In the movie Chasing Coral, in parts of it, it's illuminated.
Yeah.
We didn't really understand all of that.
Yeah, so here's the cool thing, and we'll talk about it, but I'm going to preface this with we don't actually know. This is one of the big questions in coral science is why are those corals fluorescing? Now, our idea is that when our oceans get really warm, they also tend to, particularly in Australia, it's also a time period in which we don't have a whole lot of wind or storms. So the water gets really flat. We call it glass top. And there's not a whole lot of mixing. So you don't have big waves coming and mixing cool water with hot water. It can get very stagnant, not a whole lot of water movement. And what that does is it allows the sun to really pound more light into the water. And what the corals are doing, at least what we think they're doing, is not actually protecting themselves from the heat. They're protecting themselves from the excess sunlight. So just like we put sunscreen on so that we don't get sunburned or damage our skin, corals are actually doing that as well. But they're building it themselves, and it happens to be really, really pretty. But to close this out, we literally do not know exactly what the process is or why they're doing it. And any of you who are listening to this still could get into college in a handful of years, and you could get your PhD if you found that problem out.
Oh, okay, I have to go ahead. We have one more.
Very cool.
Does sunscreen have a negative effect on coral reefs?
Our sunscreen?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it does and it doesn't. So it's kind of a weird one. In a laboratory setting, we know for sure that sunscreen has a negative impact on corals, particularly on those baby corals we talked about with the wiggly butts. They definitely don't like the sunscreen. Now, that's because in a laboratory setting, it's very controlled, right? Whereas we're putting a particular amount of sunscreen in a particular amount of water, and that can really damage the corals. In the real world, the ocean is very, very large, and the amount of sunscreen that we're inputting it is likely over the globe to be kind of negligible. Now, where it gets different is, let's say, what's a good example? Like Waikiki in Hawaii, that has hundreds, maybe even thousands of people visiting every day, and all of those people are wearing sunscreen. Now, that's a lot of sunscreen for one local area, and that's definitely going to make the corals pretty unhappy. So we've started to see areas that have a lot of tourism and coral reefs begin to ban particular types of sunscreens. So we've seen this in Hawaii, we've seen it in a lot of the southern Pacific countries. The Florida Keys just passed something to ban sunscreens. So at a local level, we definitely have to think very carefully about our sunscreens. But luckily, we've already begun to use better and better sunscreens. So they're definitely damaging in areas that are really, really popular for snorkelers and divers and beachgoers. But overall, I think that it's probably not the worst thing. You have to think about it very locally.
So I think you're going to be able to. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Great question. So we'll head to Miss Hallmark's classroom, and we'll take one more class work question from there, and then we'll wrap things up.
Cool.
What is the big animal you like?
Is it what's the biggest animal?
What is the big animal with the coral reef and focuses into it?
Oh, what's the biggest animal that you see on coral reefs?
What is an animal called coral reef?
What would happen to it?
Oh, what happens to the bigger animals?
What happens if a big animal hits a coral reef? Like, what are the effects?
Oh, so most animals don't necessarily hit the coral reefs, right? But it's surprising that really big animals actually come to the coral reefs. So let's say whales and dolphins and sharks, they tend to eat and breed in really productive waters. So coral reefs are non-productive waters because they don't have nutrients. whales and whatnot like to eat in places like Alaska and Northern California and South America, where there's a lot of plankton and a lot of life. But they actually spend a lot of time on coral reefs because that's where they give birth. So most of these creatures want to give birth in nice, warm, friendly waters rather than maybe the pretty rough, cold waters up north or in Antarctica. They come to the coral reefs where it's warm and nice, and they allow their babies to get born in those conditions so that they have a better opportunity to survive. I hope that was your question, but it's kind of cool to think about how so much life comes to the coral reefs just for moments. In fact, a third of all life in the ocean spends some point in time in the coral reef.
Do we have any more questions from Ms. Hallmark's class before we wrap it up?
Yes, we do have one
Awesome.
more. Go ahead. Okay. She asked, can you name any different types of coral? She was asking for 5, but I'm sure you can name a lot of them.
Yeah, I definitely can. So by trade, I'm a taxonomist, which basically means that what I do is figure out what things are named and what they are. For corals, it's kind of hard because in total, when it comes to the corals I work on, there's about 1,800 different species. In the Great Barrier Reef where I work, there's about 430 corals that I get to work with. And most of them I know their names, at least to their genus. But I don't know. I could name you some of them. So here's a brief lesson in Latin as well. So Latin's very important to me because most of our names in science have Latin bases. So one of the most common corals that we see is called an acropora. And they're the ones that are very branching. They look like this, and they're crazy, crazy structures. But what acropora means in Latin actually tells you what the coral is. So I wish I had a skeleton, but I don't. Acroporas have these branches, so they're like sticks, and they have a polyp, or a little hole at the very top of the stick. So a pore right here. And in Latin, acro means top, and pora stands for pore. So if you're in the ocean and you see a stick and it has a little circle at the very tip, that means it's an acropora because it stands for top pore. And if you see that top little hole, then you know you have an acropora.
We're all becoming coral scientists.
There's also some really pretty names. So there's one called Galaxia, which totally does look like a galaxy, like it's stars, and they have really pretty names sometimes. I think Galaxia is one of my favorites, though.
Very cool. So why don't we head to Ms. Capella's classroom so we can get one more question in, and then we can say goodbye.
Also, everybody, when you guys are done with this, look up a coral called frog spawn coral. So it's my favorite coral, for sure. Its species name is Euphyllia paradivisa, but that's not necessarily important to remember. But frog spawn coral is super cool. It looks like it came out of Avatar, and they're just absolutely beautiful. So that's my favorite coral, just throwing it out there.
Okay, Ms. Capella's classroom.
Can coral live in different types of weather?
Yeah, so really good question. And the answer is kind of. So the corals that I'm talking about are like our reef building corals, so to speak, the ones that you're going to find in Australia and the Caribbean. They need a lot of light and they need a lot of clean, warmish water. And that kind of only happens in the tropics. So, you know, in Indonesia, in that area, or in the Caribbean, where it's nice, clean, tropical weather, that's where corals usually like. But there's another type of coral that I don't work on that don't photosynthesize. So you know how we talked about how we're going to go outside and sunbathe like corals? Well, there are some that don't do that. There are some corals that eat just like you and me, and they can live in the Arctic. In fact, there's a lot of corals in Washington State, in the Puget Sound. There's probably some corals just off the coast of Ontario in Canada. There are very, very different corals, but they're usually like a single little coral. It's not big colonies that build a reef. They're little tiny individuals that eat plankton out of the water, but they can live in very cold water. So it's a very good question, but I don't know a whole lot about them because I don't work on them.
Very good. Well, I feel like we all got a little bit of a better understanding of corals after talking to Zack today. So we only have 2 questions, and by 2 questions I mean 2 classrooms left. Why don't we give Zack a big thank you for joining us and to talking with us a little bit more about his favorite subject. So thank you for joining us, guys.
Thank you guys. You guys all had awesome questions. Thanks so much for joining me today.
And Zack left us with a little bit more excitement, so you can Google some of the his favorite corals, so you guys can see a bit more of the ocean that way too. What were those corals again, Zack?
I would just look up the frog spawn coral, but its genus name is also worth looking up because they're just really pretty. But they're called Euphyllia, and it's spelled EUPHYLLIA.
There we go. Okay. All right, we'll just stop the broadcast now.